All set. Good evening. For whoever sent me a note, the sound, couldn't hear anything. We were waiting for people to sign in who had registered. Good evening again. My name is Lawrence Berliner. I'm an attorney in the field of special education. We're doing another webinar in a series that we are putting on Tuesday evening and Friday morning. Tonight, our guest is Dr. Ben Powers, who's the headmaster of the Southport School. And we're going to have an interview format. We encourage you to submit your questions. This is on Zoom, and you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A format and a chat format. We would prefer if you use the Q&A format because this webinar is being recorded and the privacy features for chat are not there, so that becomes public, whereas the privacy features for Q&A are maintains your privacy. I need to provide a disclaimer. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for anybody who's registered for future use. The information provided during the webinar does not constitute specific legal advice to you or to your child's circumstances and should not be relied upon as such. The webinar does not establish an attorney-client relationship with myself, Lawrence Berliner. By signing up, you have agreed to receive information about future webinars, and one of our partners is the Stamford Jewish Community Center. And we are working with them on additional webinars, which we will announce towards the end of tonight's presentation. This format that we're using tonight is Zoom, which is a third-party provider. It is not affiliated or is considered an agent of the law office of Lawrence Berliner, myself, or the Southport School. We ask that you keep your questions general, non-specific, so all participants can gain as much insight as possible. We have a very diverse group of individuals this evening. We have parents, employees of various state agencies. We even have somebody from one of the New York schools registered. We have public schools in Connecticut, educators from public schools and educators from private schools. All are welcome, and we welcome your questions and anything you can add to the discussion. Our topic tonight, or topics I should say, will include differentiated instruction tailored to meet the individual needs of students, how the educational landscape is being permanently changed in this era of school closure. What are the struggles associated with teaching children with learning disabilities, especially with the online format? And how schools such as the Southport School, which is a school for students with language-based learning disabilities, are making a difference in providing meaningful learning opportunities. And I'd like to know how the Southport School is preparing students for the next step in their lives and in their education. We have maybe Dr. Powers during his presentation can give contact information. We have no slides, but I just wanted to give contact information. My website is berlinerspecialedlaw.com. That's BERLINSPECILED law.com, one word. And we have a Facebook page where a lot of information is posted, and that's www.facebook.com/BerlinerSpecialEdLaw/ and we provide information, articles, announcements in Facebook and on our website. Ben Powers, or Dr. Ben Powers, is a researcher, practitioner, and an advocate who works with students with dyslexia and ADHD. He's also proficient in Russian and French, but he's agreed to talk to us this evening in English. So we're benefit, but if anybody wants to speak to them in Russian or French, I'm sure he'll accommodate. Dr. Powers has numerous degrees besides his doctorate degree, bachelor's degree, and master's level degrees from all too many universities, both here in America and on the European continent. I'm not going to get into that, but I will focus on what I think is important. His research is promoting self-esteem, self-efficacy, especially for adolescents with learning disabilities and ADHD, to help them understand the impact on their social and emotional well-being. Dr. Powers is engaged in a lot of research, collaboration, community-based instruction besides running a school. He is he's an associate member of the Orton Gillingham organization. He's a certified dyslexia practitioner. He's affiliated with the Dyslexia Foundation. Maybe Dr. Powers can talk a little bit about what he does with the Haskins Lab. He's involved with the National Center on Improving Literacy. And as I said, most important, he is the headmaster, actually second most important. He's also a father of children and a husband, so that's probably his most important qualities. I must also add he's a pretty good friend, and I've always found him to be stimulating with his words of wisdom, and how the Southport School, a school for students with learning disabilities, ADHD, language-based learning disabilities, has made a difference in the lives of those children and students in preparing them for the next step in their lives. So if we were live and in person, we'd probably have an applause at this point in time, but I'm not going to have a laugh track or an applause track, and we'll let Dr. Powers introduce himself, talk about his background, and then we can get into some of the questions that I've outlined, and then we'll get to your questions later on in this webinar.
Well, thank you, Larry, first of all, thank you for having me on tonight and for doing this for families. It's a really great service. And I'd also like to thank the JCC for being a partner in this. It doesn't seem like it was too long ago that we were at the JCC in Stamford with Jackie Jewett and Beth Sugarman and some of our other colleagues to talk about IEPs and PPTs and public schools versus independent schools for kids with learning disabilities. So always grateful for the support, and thank you also, Larry, for your friendship. It's you know, this is an interesting space, education and education law, for kids who learn differently, but it's a really close community, and I often reflect on how strong and significant some of the relationships that we've built over the years through connected work has really just been such a great, adjacent payoff for all the work that we do to help these kids. So, you asked about, you gave some background on my, my education and my career. And I think, Larry, what it boils down to is I think for the same thing, the same reason you get up in the morning, it's that we know that there are a significant number of kids who lack access to effective instruction. And right now, that's more true than ever. And not because people don't want to get them access to instruction, not because people don't have excellent intention. It's an unprecedented circumstance, that, as we were talking about earlier before we started tonight, that, you haven't seen in your career. I mean, none of us anticipated this. At the same time, I think it really has highlighted why what we do in special ed is inefficient and not necessarily the most effective way to engage kids, because we've kind of funneled all of our kids in special ed in most mainstream public school environments. We've kind of funneled them through a small number of individuals who are trained as special educators. And those special educators have such a huge burden day to day in normal operating conditions. And now they're tasked with really what seems to be an almost insurmountable challenge, given the current resources in play, to be able to actually make meaningful connections and instruction with kids. And I think at the core of that is really the concept, and you hit on it at the beginning when you talked about some of what we're going to talk about tonight. But at the core of this is really this sense of differentiated instruction. And at a base level, differentiated instruction really means finding the individual ways to engage kids in content, in learning. And so it can be providing a student with a different pathway for learning, whether that's the pathway to help teach that student something, or the reverse. It can be a different pathway for that child to be able to demonstrate what they've learned or express and share their thoughts and ideas. So, in the traditional model, the special ed teachers have really been that funnel where a lot of kids had to get funneled through them. And again, now they're in this position where, they're having to really meet a lot of core needs for their kids with, unfortunately, a real hindrance on their ability to differentiate instruction. And when we moved to online learning at the Southport School, we certainly had a lot of advantages. We used technology a lot with our kids to differentiate instruction, so we had a strong platform for that. But again, the difference between live, in-person, physical connection versus trying to do that remotely is more challenging. I mean, there's no two ways about it. It's more challenging, and it's a huge lift for the teachers. It's a huge lift for the students. It's a huge lift for the faculty. But again, I think that, what we've really seen is, a real focus on trying to be able to differentiate that instruction for the students, and, figuring out how to provide them with those independent experiences that we know they need, the independent classwork experiences, those types of things we know they need, and support them effectively, from a distance. And empower and equip the parents to do that in a way that they're comfortable with. So it's been a big lift, and it's not been easy. And there are challenges that I think all schools face right now. But the flip side, and I think this is one of the things I am really excited about, Larry. The flip side is one component of the differentiation that's been a struggle in public schools up until this time, or in a lot of even mainstream schools, private schools, public schools, doesn't matter, is been on things like concepts like assessment and assessing kids. And, I heard educators asking, well, how are we going to assess kids remotely? You can't give them a standardized test that way. And, for a lot of our kids, for LD kids, standardized assessments aren't great. And so I think, this is going to push the envelope a little bit in terms of thinking about how do we assess kids, all kids, not LD, ADHD kids. How do we assess all kids? How do we provide pathways both to teach and reach them, and then also for them to be able to demonstrate, share, experience knowledge? And so, while there are a number of challenges, I also think coming out of this, there may be some new opportunities, again, to be able to reach LD, ADHD kids, and for them to be able to express and demonstrate to educators and parents and adults what they do know and how well they know it.
I've had many parents, particularly parents of children with dyslexia and attention issues, basically telling me the online format is not accessible or usable to their child or children. Is there something that you're using at the Southport School to overcome those obstacles, whether somebody's attention wanes on computer versus being in a classroom, or somebody's unable to, in effect, read an online chapter and answer questions without direct instruction?
Well, yeah, it's a great question, Larry. And of course, those are challenges. I think, independent schools like ours, private independent special ed schools like ours, come into a situation like the one we're in now, although unexpected, with a number of advantages over public schools or maybe more typical independent school environments. Number one, our classes are a lot smaller. So our average class size, is about 4 kids. So, I think about my own children at home. I have a son in 2nd grade. I think there are about 24 kids in his public school classroom. For that teacher to get on Zoom with 24 kids is, and actually they can't use Zoom. They have to use something else because of, the security issues. But, it's a challenge. I mean, it's a huge challenge. And, facilitating that, it's like, do you remember, you must remember, Larry, like when the smart boards came out, everybody was making a big deal about the smart boards, right? So, that's great. Smart boards are great, but, a smart board in one person's classroom can look very different from a smart board in another classroom. And I think the challenge with all of this is, are we viewing the tools that we're using now as, a way to replace what was happening before? Or are we trying to find out or figure out ways to use them maybe differently to be, as effective or more effective in certain ways that, that are going to be beneficial long-term. So, again, us having small class sizes, we leverage a lot of technology. In fact, on Thursday, we're offering another free webinar through the Southport Collab on using Keynote. One of the great things we do with some of our younger kids, a lot of the younger kids are really challenged right now, as you can imagine. The K-3 kind of band is really tough for parents, for teachers, and for the K-3 kids. They don't have a huge attention span, and there's a lot going on there. And then when you layer in, like you talked about, how do you access kids who, if they can't read, whether it's because they have a learning or attention issue or because they're just 5 or 6 years old, it's you've got to be able to break down those barriers. So, using technology and platforms that are designed, not in response to something like the coronavirus, but that were designed prior to this to be able to engage kids, in the classroom or remotely. We've been able to leverage a lot of those tools that we use to do that. And I think the other piece is that, we give a lot of flexibility to our teachers and to the students in terms of, projects and how they do things. And, that what I was going to talk about for Thursday from the collab, we're doing, one of our teachers is going to do a great presentation on how to facilitate writing with little kids. And, these are 1st, 2nd graders. And, this was work we were doing here before all this happened. And, it was really finding ways to engage our kids in reading, writing, spelling through multiple modalities, and in a way that, again, can reflect what they know and they want to say. And you can leverage technology. And an example of this would be having students draft a piece, on paper or on a laptop, and then have them dictate it and record it, and then have them layer pictures into it. So, the teacher or the parent or the audience can understand, what did they say and what were they actually trying to say? And so we can use that for things like editing and, peer editing and all those great things. But then we can also understand, what potential is in the student, because sometimes our kids are not always able to express themselves as much or as fully as they want to because they don't have the right tools to do it. So, we're trying to, again, we're really using the tools, and we have an incredible director of technology. She's our chief technology integrator, Sharon Plant. She's actually, she's known nationally as an expert in the field of assistive and instructive technologies. And she's been here for a long time, and is a huge resource and trains all of our staff. So again, leveraging those tools, using those tools to be able to engage our kids is critically important.
Are there any specific platforms that you're using for your instruction?
So, it really is a lot of it is, student skill dependent, class material dependent, and age dependent. But, on a baseline for our live classes, we are using Zoom. We went right out the door with that just because, we knew there were a lot of features in there that could be helpful for our kids. But we also use a lot of tools like Class Kick is one of them. Class Kick is a really great tool. We're actually really excited. There's a new literacy game that's really designed for pre-K through all the way through, I would say, about 5th or 6th grade. This is a literacy game that was designed by a group of Haskins affiliated researchers in Finland about 20 years ago. And it was actually funded by Nokia after the research was done. That Nokia funded this research into a game platform so that all the kids in Finland could have access to this for free through a Nokia phone, because they were the big player in town at that time. And over the years, the research on leveraging technology to teach, supplement, and reinforce literacy skills has really grown. And the university, it's the University of Jyväskylä in Finland, since they're Haskins affiliated researchers, they've been working with different Haskins affiliated researchers around the world. We've places like Rio de Janeiro in France, and other places in Europe, and now with us here in the United States. And we're actually going to be releasing this literacy game for free in the United States, likely next week. And it's I think the only game that's come directly from research and actually has credible research behind it to show the efficacy of instruction for younger kids around literacy. But one of the things, and I'm mentioning this because you brought it up earlier, Larry, one of the big pieces about something like this, and it's something we take into account when we're thinking about your last question about all the technology, is it something kids can actually access? Because a lot of these platforms require, there's a great platform, Kahoot, which is something we use here at the school. Even prior to all this, we've used it for years, where it's an online game. It's an online gaming platform where teachers can put in questions, or we can have school-wide challenges or class-wide challenges. But of course, you need an internet connection to do that. And so a lot of kids, and I think I think they, certainly at the legislative level, they've known this, but there's a big light being shown on the fact that there's a number of kids who either, don't have access because they're in a rural setting, or because it's an affordability issue. They don't have access to the internet. And, so we're also trying to, when we suggest platforms or games to people, we're also trying to be mindful of that. It's actually one of the reasons why we were excited about this, this game that we're going to be releasing next week, Graphel Game, because once you download it, you don't need an internet connection. So it's something, again, I think we have to be really mindful of in this time.
Well, I was surprised to learn in Connecticut, of all places, that approximately 14% of the households in Connecticut either do not have reliable internet, Wi-Fi, or computers. I was surprised to hear that, especially since some wealthy philanthropists donated 60,000 laptops to be distributed throughout Connecticut. Probably should add a zero to that, to help at least make the computers available, but there was no corresponding increase with making the Wi-Fi or the internet connections available. So I was surprised. And did you have to encounter that when you were going from in-person to online instruction?
We there were definitely people we had to help get online, either because they didn't have internet access in the home. That was, my recollection, Larry, is that in those cases, it was all a matter of choice. So it was that, either families or, or even teachers didn't have the internet in their home by choice. And so it wasn't that they weren't able to access it. We were able to get that turned on pretty quickly. But again, just, thinking about the broader landscape there, and the number you highlighted, there are just a number of families in Connecticut who just don't have reliable internet service. And those kids are, I think, in your work, better than I do, Larry, the gap that already exists between, mainstream education and kids who are classified in special ed. And, what's happening right now is going to cause an even bigger shift or bigger gap in, when we look at in the mainstream population, kids coming from areas of, affluence or, with or resourced areas versus kids who are in areas of poverty. I think we're going to see, obviously even greater shifts in those communities. There's going to be an even bigger impact. There's going to be an even larger gap in outcomes for those kids, and also for kids in special education. And again, it's not because people don't want to help these kids. I think, there's just a huge resource issue right now.
You mentioned the Haskins lab. It's really a two-part question covering, I think, the same subject matter. You mentioned the CoLab, you mentioned the Haskins lab. Could you provide a little background on both? I know the CoLab is directly part of the Southport School, and you're affiliated with the Haskins lab, which I didn't realize is no longer part of the Yale University. Is that correct?
Oh no, Haskins is affiliated directly with Yale and UConn. So it's
okay. I thought it was a private independent organization. So
no, it's a 501c3, and it's actually the Haskins Labs is where they sent the Watergate tapes, believe it or not, all those years ago. It's really the epicenter for research on spoken and written language, and there's a great history there, and it's jointly affiliated with Yale and UConn. And so the Haskins Labs are actually very close to Yale's campus in New Haven. And there are affiliated and senior research scientists all over the world. And it provides an incredible platform. Haskins was really groundbreaking when it started, because part of the objective was to really partner and collaborate with leading researchers and scientists all over the world. And at the time Haskins was really created, that didn't happen in most places. Most research was done in silos, these kind of multidisciplinary or, multi-continent research teams it just didn't exist. And so Haskins was a real trailblazer in that, and they've continued to do that. And so we benefit from the collective experience of a lot of researchers in the space of reading, writing, spelling, speech production, hearing, from all over the world. And there are a number of projects going on. And right now, one of the projects we have going on is called Rescue, and it's a research project funded by the NSF, and they're funding this project to see, if we can measure what's you're familiar with the concept of summer slide for kids, right? So, the 8 or 10 weeks normally in summer when kids,
right, certainly.
Action. So, what this grant is really investigating is COVID slide. So, we've got this period of time from COVID. Now we know it's going to be coupled with summer. So, this significantly larger time, that this is a good example of work we're trying to do to understand, what is happening, what's effective for student engagement, what does it look like, where are kids dropping off, so that we can use that data and that research to really help inform educators. And we work with public and private schools, and it's just a really inspiring place to be and to feel the research happening right around you, because it's really shifted what we've been able to do with kids over the last 20 years. And that's really the goal of the CoLab. So our Southport CoLab is, it's directly affiliated with our school, but the CoLab really came from this idea that there are so many great organizations in the field of dyslexia and ADHD, attentional issues, language-based learning disabilities. There are so many great research centers and labs and schools, some of whom are doing the same work or, duplicating efforts, or they're not aware of other people's efforts. So, the reason we founded the CoLab, and the reason it's called the CoLab, is it's designed to be a collaborative. And I think this time period is really demonstrating the value of that. We're collaborating on a number of free resources that we're providing. We knew preschool was going to be an area hard hit, so right away we started developing free preschool content for parents and teachers that they can give out to kids. And it's I have a 4-year-old daughter. It's easy enough to kind of give it to her, and she can kind of walk herself through it. So we're working to provide a number of resources that benefit the students who go to our school, but also benefit, teachers, educators, students, far beyond our walls. And again, we're trying to put out, as much knowledge, and free resources as we can to help support everybody through this time.
Eventually, you touched upon this, how we're in the midst of some kinds of changes brought upon by the school closures for this prolonged period of time. Do you foresee any permanent changes to education as a result of what we're learning during this period of time of the school closures? I mean, schools are going to reopen at some point in time. Are there going to be lasting effect, permanent changes that you foresee?
Boy, I hope so, Larry. I really hope so. It's this may be an unpopular opinion, but about I would say kind of maybe late February or early March, a colleague and I were doing a school visit, and there are so many amazing programs out there. There's so much good work being done in the space of education. At the same time, how many adults do you know, Larry, that they go to their job and every 41 minutes they move to a different topic? Right? I mean, that's just not how it works, right? And if anything, what this whole issue of coronavirus, is highlighting about our instructional models in the United States, it's that, for most adults, if you work in a job as an adult where you're working on projects and assignments and you have some degree of flexibility in how you approach your day, the transition to home, although challenging and likely less efficient and, probably frustrating, and, there's a lot of negatives to it. The reality is, you were probably capable, or most adults who are in a position like that are likely capable of figuring out how to get work done from home. And the challenge with our kids as students is that that's not how it works. In education, it's a pipeline, right? It's like teacher, pipeline, kids. And when that pipeline is disrupted, boy, oh boy, we're in huge trouble. And unfortunately, the pipeline, is about as thick as this pen because it relies on, a really small front entrance door to come in the building, or, whatever bandwidth you have available to push out in remote learning. But it's all there supporting, an approach that's really outdated. And, if anything, I hope this really gives a lot of pause for people to be thinking about, how do we teach children in the United States from, what does a school day look like? How do we run classes? What are we trying to teach them, and the content and the delivery methods? Because, we can keep doing what we did, and we can keep benchmarking and measuring ourselves against those things on outdated assessments, or we can say, let's shift how we actually view student progress in relation to those metrics, and just say, when I lived in New York State before when I used to run a school in New York State, Larry, the New York State was dealing with the regents, and, one decision they made was, well, let's just lower the score, right? Let's lower the benchmark. So we can keep lowering benchmarks. We can keep creating assessments that fit what we did, or we can look at, what are we learning from this experience? What are the opportunities, and what are the roadblocks, and how do we really rethink how we teach kids in this country? That includes thinking about equitable access for instruction.
I like that last phrase, equitable access for instruction. Have parents of students at your school, have they required any kind of extra support or training from your teachers? Because our homes have now become schools, parents have now become teachers, class monitors, if they're providing any extra supports, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech and language, behavioral supports. I don't know if any of those apply to the Southport School, but parents are often taking on a lot more responsibility for the education of their children. And I was just wondering if they have sought out resources, training from the Southport School, and how you've responded.
Yeah, it's, and again, it's a huge, this time is a huge lift on parents. And, I don't want to stereotype or, or seem gender biased, but, I think we all recognize that a large portion of this has fallen on the shoulders of a lot of moms. And, that's anecdotal, but, I think it's what we see when we go on Facebook or, any social media platform. It's a huge responsibility. And, I would suggest that probably nearly every single one of our families needed some level of support, even just and it's been different. Some parents are looking for support on, how to get their child organized and engaged, and Larry, it won't be a surprise to you. It's a lot like our kids. You can have a kid with ADHD who can't initiate, or you can have a kid who initiates a ton but can't persevere through different tasks. So they've got a million things, all over the house. So just like our kids, how they, their learning or attention issues may manifest themselves differently. It's the same thing in this case. Some parents have needed help, guidance, support, resources, and we've pushed resources out to them. Both through direct communication resources we've compiled, and then through the collab. And in fact, even for the collab, we're compiling resources for all families, not just for our families in our school, but for all families, like for the summer, applications, resources they might that might be beneficial for them. And we have all that listed on our website. We also are offering short trainings for our parents, and we do those normally, Larry. And in fact, those normally take place on campus. And so we actually had a series, a 3-part series that we do for our families. It's a free workshop series we do for all of our families on executive function. And it's a three morning workshop series. We had to kind of push all that online. And so, we are continuing to do those things online. Some parents need a lot of help and support, either because of, they're challenged with technology and their child might not be great with technology, or they might be young, or, because, they really, may not be able to have the right response for things like math class. Math is a huge challenge. So, again, I would suggest that all parents have needed help during this time. I think, I know I have. So I'm sure all of our parents have needed help in a different way. But again, one advantage we have with our small class sizes and our our community is that we've got 53 people on staff for 113 kids. And, that includes our advisors, and our advisors check in with our families and our parents. And, we've had, online meetings with them, and we're meeting with our faculty all the time. And we actually just put a survey out to our parents last week. And, so we've been, collecting a lot of data about, what is working, what can we shift, and also getting that data from kids and, working with them and seeing what they need. And honestly, Larry, and you, again, this won't come as a surprise to you, but sometimes our parents and our kids, they just need a human they trust on the other end to help coach them through something. They can do it themselves. Like all of our kids, they all have the potential inside them. It's not a lack of potential that's the issue. It's a lack of translating that potential into action. And so sometimes it's just that helping hand of support, or that, that friendly listener, that other person in the room to be there.
You've been in the field of educating students with learning disabilities or learning challenges, as I'll keep it a little broader. Are there any struggles particularly associated with teaching and the education of children with learning disabilities, in your experience?
So let me ask you a clarifying question. Like, do you mean generally speaking, or or?
Well, you're out of the entire student population, you're serving a very select subset. And so the subset, as I understand it, are students with ADD, ADHD, and language-based learning disabilities,
Yeah.
primarily, if not exclusively. So within that subset of the entire population, are there any specific struggles that you've encountered and struggles you've overcome with the education and teaching of children with learning
Oh,
disabilities.
yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you for clarifying. I wasn't sure if you were, if it was something specific to this time period right now, but yeah, I mean, it's one thing that led me to the research that I ended up doing, Larry, about, looking at self-esteem and the self-efficacy perceptions of kids. You know, we, we can teach these kids. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, these are incredible kids. They're full of potential. It's finding the right way to access them. And, it's, there are always challenges, when you're bringing kids in from various schools. We've got kids coming in with all different skill sets, different schools, different states. I mean, we've got families who relocate to Connecticut to be here to enroll their child in a school like ours. So, one of the, I would say one of the biggest challenges every year is that you've got kids coming in, from all over with all different backgrounds, all different gaps, all in all different trajectories. And, at first and I give a huge amount of credit to our director of education, Jeff Ruggiero, who plans the programming for all these kids. But, you look at kind of this disparate group of kids with all these different, all these different areas of need and different areas of skill. And, from when I first started teaching kids with dyslexia, when I started at Kildonan back in 2000, as a teacher, you kind of felt like, how am I going to bring these kids together? Like even when I taught something like U.S. history, you've got, I remember, I'll never forget, like 8 kids in my class, and they had all different skill sets. And so I think, unfortunately, before kids get to a school like ours, what happens is that they take the skills of our kids, they kind of identify like the lowest skill, let's say reading, and then they say, okay, so that's the common denominator. Reading, we're going to make that the lowest common denominator across the board for all the subjects. And so, a kid comes into U.S. history class and they've only been exposed to material that's at their reading level. Well, their cognitive level may be significantly higher than that, and that's usually always the case, when we look at kids who come into our school. And so, it's challenging, I think, number one, to learn how to differentiate instruction across a classroom like that. And it's challenging, number two, to actually rebuild the stamina of these kids, because before they get to a school like ours, some of them have been, and I'm not a huge fan of this word enabling, but some of them have been enabled because either they've been asked to do less, which is sometimes appropriate and sometimes not, or somebody's done the work for them, or they've been pulled out of the class, or expectations have been lowered based on that lowest common denominator. So that is a huge challenge when you're working with these kids, is, finding that space to get them connected and on the same page, and to find, help them rebuild that stamina. Because as we tell parents, don't be surprised in the fall when your student starts at our school that they're going to come home tired every day, because they are tired. I mean, the flip side of that is, though, a lot of that, before our kids get to a school like ours, and again, goes back to why I ended up doing this research, I think the bigger lift longer term, Larry, is really around self-esteem. I think that a lot of our kids, unless we get them very young, a lot of our kids, whether subconsciously or consciously, but between 2nd and 5th grade, sometime in that range, they really start to identify that, or they self-identify in a way that isolates them from other kids. And sometimes, that manifests itself in a way where our kids can feel less than, even though couldn't be further from the truth. So, I think longer term, that's big thing we think about a lot is, how do we help our kids be really strong self-advocates, be really aware of who they are as learners, and, that they're confident walking out the door, talking about what they need, and being proud of who they are, and knowing that they are so full of potential and they have all this capability.
Yeah, you mentioned 3rd or 4th grade. Anecdotally, I have seen this happen all too often, where we're shifting the paragon from learning how to read to reading to learn. And those that are struggling with reading aren't keeping up with the pace of instruction or their peers. And that's where I have found the self-esteem, the self-confidence, the competence not willing to take a risk. If I could turn a light switch on and disappear in my classroom, starts to set in. So I don't know if that's the kind of student that's arriving at the Southport School. I wanted to shift. This might be a good time. We have a couple of questions that have been logged in, but prior to this evening, we had a couple of questions that were sent to us in anticipation of Dr. Powers. Some of them I think are appropriate, but one is more a legal question, so I will try to answer that person's question. It sounds like parent has a child in a private school and doesn't feel like they're getting the supports. And because schools are closed right now, whether or not they should even pursue their legal rights, their procedural safeguards. And what I would tell parents, don't give up. I mean, this COVID virus health emergency will end at some point in time. There will be some sense of normalcy returning to our lives and our lives of our children. The COVID-19 virus did not repeal the free appropriate public education standard within the federal and state special education law, which means you should continue to access and pursue your rights, including, if necessary, going forward with a due process hearing. I should add that based upon an April 6, 2020 memo from the State Department of Education, due process hearings are being temporarily suspended for up to 90 days because schools have been closed. The State Department of Education is working at a reduced load with their employees often out of telecommuting. And one factor I just learned a couple of weeks ago, that the court reporters that the State Department of Education uses for due process hearings went out of business. So they have to find another court reporter. Another concern that a parent raised in the same question was the school district is not teaching to our students, especially those with learning disabilities. There's almost no live teaching going on. And the students are left to educate themselves with online course materials. What I would say to that parent is there's another letter from the State Department of Education, and these are available on the State Department of Education's website. ct.gov is the State Department of Education website, and it's an April 24th, 2020 letter discussing PPT meetings, online education. And you should refer to that letter and, if necessary, request a PPT meeting about the education that is or is not being provided, that is or is not accessible to your child, and whether or not the online instruction format has to be revised so it's accessible and usable to the child. Another question that came in involved whether students who used to have live human beings supporting them in the classroom, such as paraprofessionals, are unable to access their online or virtual education without such live and in-person facilitation. Do you encounter anything like that where supports that were formerly provided in a classroom, in-person classroom setting, are not being provided, and there's a need to assist the student in this era of online instruction?
So, I mean, in our school, at least, Larry, we have speech and language services, which we are pushing in remotely into, through Zoom. So we're pushing out our speech and language services that way, like they were done in the past. And then, we have a school counselor and a school psychologist, and actually they've been, as you can imagine, it won't be a surprise either, they've been busier than ever. And so they're pushing in into classes and and working with, students or families as necessary, whether it's, we've got, just like any other time, we've got kids who are struggling with, content. We've got kids or family who are struggling with family issues like the loss of a grandparent or, a family pet or whatever the case is. We've got a number of, those things haven't changed. Those things are still happening. And part of, while I answer this question, I think that's part of what's really, it's easy to forget during a time like this that, we're so focused on the remote learning and we're so focused on, all the change that's occurred, and it is a lot. But sometimes I think we forget that the rest of life is still happening in some ways. And so, for kids too, like, for adults, this is a different thing for us to process than it is for, a kid. And for a 7-year-old kid, it's very different for, a 15-year-old kid. So, each of our kids is processing this differently, but their world goes on. They want to know that somebody knows it's their birthday. So, we're one of our students, it was his birthday, and his mom put together like a flip grid so teachers could, wish him birthday announcements, or, trying to find ways to highlight, highlight or connect with kids. But even like our advisors, we are a number of our, most of our administrators are advisors of students, and Dr. B, like Dr. B this morning, one of her students was, just having a tough, a tough time. It's that point in the school year anyway. And so, she got on Zoom and had breakfast with her this morning. And, so these touch points, these connections, they need to happen. And, but it is challenging. And I think if you're a parent at home, or, you're worried about those connections that your child may not be experiencing with their teacher, or maybe the teacher, for some teachers, this feels great. Not that it's the same as the classroom, but they're comfortable in an online place. Some of our teachers, not some teachers, it's a totally different ballgame for them, and they may be less comfortable. And so I see this with my, my own children in public school. Each of them is getting a very different amount of interaction and classroom time, live, classroom instruction. And so I would encourage parents to, if you're concerned about that, or you're thinking about that, and there's something that's not going well for you, I would just pick up the phone and call somebody in your child's school. I think, as long as you approach it from, a reasonable standpoint, and, you come at it with a reasonable expectation, I think, educators get in this work because they want to educate and help kids and families. And, I think, I think most schools or people would appreciate the call and are glad to know what's working or what's not working. So, so if that's a challenge at home, just make sure you keep in touch. And I think that's the same, Larry, when we're talking about, PPTs, IEP, thinking about whether an IEP needs to be updated, or there's triennial testing or whatever's going on. At least, and I only speak from my own personal circumstance about my own children, it's reaching out proactively, saying, okay, so what's your plan for this? We know this evaluation's coming up, the triennial just happened. We know we need to have a meeting, so like we reached out to the school, said, what's the plan for this? How do we go about scheduling one? So, so we're not in a predicament where, the time has come and gone and we're now trying to pick up the pieces.
Online communication, which is back and forth, is critically important, especially now when the educators are not seeing their students in a classroom setting all the time. So parents are the educators, parents are taking the data, they're seeing their child perform or not perform in school, which is home. So it's very important that parents communicate their concerns, the good with the bad with the good, with what's happening with the online instruction. Do you have any suggestions for a parent who feels that the instructor is struggling with the provision of online learning? And how can that parent address those concerns without damaging goodwill and lines of communication with the school or the instructor? Any suggestions?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And, I love analogies, so I'm going to use an analogy here. I think it's kind of like, when we train somebody to do something, if we train somebody in a swimming pool, right? We train somebody to swim like a very specific kind of, stroke in the swimming pool. And then we bring them out to the beach and we throw them into like, the Atlantic Ocean and tell them, now you need to do, well, geez, you learned, you learn the backstroke, but hop out, jump into the waves. And now I want to see you, do, something totally different. Some people are going to jump in the water and figure it out. Other people are really scared. And so, I think number one, it's important to recognize that, most schools are, most schools don't have this background and experience, and most educators don't. There are certainly schools, there are online high schools, there are online classes, online programs that have existed for a number of years, that are, they've been, highly kind of segmented and specialized. But, for most teachers, this is a whole new realm. And, I think about, for any professional who's had to put a slide deck together, a PowerPoint together for a presentation, you spend a lot of time on that. If you're going to go give a half-hour talk, you might spend hours on the slide deck, make sure they're accurate, the information's correct, the links work. So, for all these teachers, they're now trying to take, things like, their paper and pencil manipulatives, or, index cards that just aren't very useful on a screen, and now translate all of that into, a lesson. It's a lot of work. So I will suggest that I think most educators are really aware and certainly sensitive to that. And I think most school leaders are aware and sensitive to that as well. And I think my sense is that, again, if it's handled the right way, most school programs, they're going to want to know, like, this is what's working. And I always encourage parents to, to focus on, okay, so what is working? How do we make a suggestion that's going to improve the situation? So, if something, if a teacher's struggling with the online learning space, if there is something that can be identified that is working in Johnny's day, let them know that. Say, hey, this thing you're doing, this is working really well. This is where he's struggling. This is where he's falling down. Is there something different that we could do for him? Is there a different way to try this? Is there a different, because it's just not working for him. And I think if parents can take, or be thoughtful to hold any kind of, translation of that message in a way that could be construed as critical of the teacher, I think that's certainly helpful, because again, I think a lot of teachers right now they're paddling really hard in a boat that they've just, never driven before.
Good point. A parent has asked about differentiating instruction for a child who is exceptional in certain areas, not so in other areas. In other words, they have splintered skills. How do you recognize and address, those extreme strengths and those weaknesses against the areas of strength?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. And, we see this in places, whether it's something like dyslexia, where a child's vocabulary and reading comprehension is through the roof, but their decoding is awful. Or you take a child who is really bad with things like math fluency. They don't know their arithmetic or times tables. They're just not good at rote memorization of math facts, but conceptually, like, they can do physics. So, I can speak through that lens of experience, and it is really challenging. I think, again, in a small school environment like ours, where, we've got, somewhere between 2 to 8 kids in a class, you can really differentiate. In a larger environment, and what I kind of refer to as a more mainstream or public school environment, it is much more challenging. And I think, just thinking about, experiences with individual kids in the past, some of it is certainly advocating to, some of it's advocating to the school. If you feel that, your child is being not held back, but being limited in expanding those areas of potential or interest because the school is focused, and I'll use math, for example, if a kid is in 8th grade and they're still struggling with their times tables, and it's not because they haven't tried or because they haven't had instruction, that's probably time to give up on that. It's probably time to move beyond that. And if you have a kid who might not be good with their times tables, but can conceptually understand, geometry, algebra, then, you find the way to advocate for them so that you say, look, okay, let's agree that these math facts, they're probably not going to get learned the way that most kids learn them. But we're going to accommodate that through a 504 plan so that we can push forward with these other things. So that's not a limiting factor. So I think number one, advocating in a reasonable and, and mindful approach to get accommodations of the things in place so that a student who does have exceptional abilities in one area isn't being held back by work in another area that may not be relevant. I think the second thing, and you may not agree with this, Larry, because it's not something that is supported publicly, through through advocating to the school. So I say you may not agree with it because it might not be the right way to do it, but I suggest to families that are capable or able to do it to see what's out there. Like, sign your kid up for a course. Right now, I have to tell you, if you have a kid who's old enough to be able to try maybe like an online college course, in an area where they have an interest, that's a free class or something that they can take as, audit, have them try it out. I mean, they're home, they've got time. If you can't engage them somewhere else, it might be worth trying something like that. It might be worth giving them an experience because, we've found in our years that when you can take a kid who thinks they're not good at something, or you can take a kid who might feel like they have some possible potential in something, and you give them you give them the bandwidth and you pave the road for them to try it, and they're successful, holy cow, sky is the limit.
We have a question, an advocacy question to you, and given your background, experience on promoting self-esteem for students, what are your thoughts regarding students who are completely disengaged? And do you have any idea how we, as parents, can not only advocate for them, but support them during such an anxiety-provoking time as we're in right now?
Yeah, so student engagements are really, a friend of mine, he's a research scientist at Intel, Pete Denman. He's actually, he has dyslexia. He and a colleague of his are working on, they actually are working on the student engagement issue. It's a big issue. I mean, but I think, and you and I have had this conversation before, Larry, 99.999% of kids are good by nature. And, 99.999% of kids, and it's a question I always ask or I usually ask parents when they come in, what was your child like in preschool? Most of them are like, oh, they love to go to school, or it was fun, or they played, or, human beings are natural, curious learners. There are some simple things that we do, here at school on a day-to-day basis, just in a class, like a 40-minute class. We break things down. We make sure kids know that, in the course of a 40-minute class, we're going to do 5 to 8 different things so that, if it's something they don't like, they know it's only 5 to 8 minutes. Like my son, who's a second grader, Larry, his district just started, really focusing on phonics this past year. And he was coming home. I was like, I hate phonics. Phonics is the worst. Phonics is awful. And, I can understand why, maybe why he feels that way, but they're also doing it in a really big block of time. So you're like, yeah, he's 7 and, he probably doesn't want to sit for almost an hour to do phonics. That's not fun. And you get that. So, I think part of this too is finding, taking a step back. And I think this is something we all need to do right now, is take a step back and say, okay, look, we know what's normal is, what normal expectations are not happening right now in a lot of ways. And, one, let us set reasonable expectations for ourselves and our kids. And number 2, let's use this as a time of discovery, a discovery for, what works and what doesn't work in these spaces. and what works and what doesn't work for our kids. Because as much as there's, a huge block in that little, the funnel we talked about earlier of getting from the teacher to the kid, and as much as that's been exacerbated because there just aren't enough special ed resources to support kids in public schools right now, the fact that our kids are home and with their parents, as much as this is in a lot of ways, not what parents were wanting or expecting, and it's a huge burden and unfair and certainly inequitable, given that there are a number of households who do not have the time, energy, or resources to do what I'm about to suggest. But, I think being able to have a sense with your kid to say, look, what can we do right now? What is reasonable? Of all the list, in your classwork or whatever it is that the teacher has given them, if it's a lot of independent work or whatever the case is, like, okay, let's step back and say what's reasonable. Is it, can we chunk this down and say, hey, Johnny, or hey, Susie, let's just try a couple of these things today. Like, let's put a plan of success together that doesn't mean, a kid has to climb Mount Everest. Because I will tell you, Larry, my experience in most of this lack of engagement isn't because kids don't want to be engaged. It's because they're fearful. It's because they're anxious. And because, there's a lot of tension around this and they don't even know where to start. They don't know where to start. So, when they sit down and they open their Google Classroom folder and they see all this stuff, like, why would you even start? So, any help that parents can give to say, okay, let's just take two things out of here right now. And let's just see if we can do these two things successfully. And then we move forward from there.
Next question. What do you and your staff do to assist students to prepare for transitions to another school, such as going to a new school next year? Do you help families and students in that process?
It's a great question. Something we actually think about when a student is even applying. We're trying to get a sense, when a student applies, we're looking at their neuropsych or psychoed report. We're looking at, where are the gaps, what might be some of the underlying, issues that are causing some of the roadblocks in their education. So we're really thinking about that from day one. And, some of the things we do to help families prepare, number one, every year when we go through the academic year, we have 3 times where we conference with our parents. And so all of our kids, whether they're in kindergarten, first grade, or whether they're in 8th grade, they all switch, they all kind of move around during the day. They all have different teachers so that, they can have different types of engagement, which again, in a time like this is super helpful because you have one teacher who's super confident transitioning to online, another teacher who's, got other strengths and abilities. It's the beauty of having multiple teachers work with kids during the day. But the fact that our kids can, move around and have that engagement really does make a huge difference for them that way. It's a real game changer for them.
Before we went live this evening, we were talking about the transition from in-person classroom instruction to online instruction, and you were talking about Zoom versus live education. And the question is, what is your suggestion to promote live education using Zoom? You talked about having, like, I guess the equivalent of PowerPoint presentations versus live instruction. Is there, some benefit to one versus the other? Is there a benefit to the Zoom platform versus another kind of platform?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think all these platforms have certain advantages. We picked Zoom up front because it seemed like it would be less confusing for our students than something like Google Hangouts, which at the time was less intuitive. Google's done a terrific job. It seems like, kind of bringing their product line together. I think I saw an announcement last week that they had kind of have now packaged their suite of services more directly or more together. And so, but we made an early decision to use Zoom so that, again, we felt that it would lead to the greatest level of autonomy and automaticity with our kids. And, I'll give you a really specific kind of challenge, Larry. So, you're in the classroom, you've taught a concept, and then you're gonna have the kids do something around that concept, whether it's try a math problem on their own, or write a short piece that you're then going to edit as a class. When you're teaching in a physical live space, and you turn back to the kids to give them that problem or that short assignment, you're actively able to monitor all the things going on at the same time. It doesn't mean you're going to be 100%, at catching everything, or you can't see everything that's happening, but, it's much easier. Whereas just you and me right now, I'm looking at you on the screen, I'm looking at myself on the screen, trying to remember what I'm talking about, and I can't even see all the other participants. So for all I know, the other people on the Zoom right now are, who knows what they're doing. So I think part of this is, providing the live instruction and that engagement, but part of it is finding the opportunity to give that, and independent work really isn't the right language, because, it's not that we want to kind of suggest that it's something the kids should do all on their own, but it's having that chance to see the child do practice and, kind of be aware and be present of that. There's a huge value in being able to have the kids try something on their own. And we've and you guys, there were some great questions about what technology tools have you implemented. We've implemented a number of really great technology tools, like Class Kick and these other. We use Learning Ally, which is it helps with audible text. We use a number of Keynote. We use a number of really great tools. But the flip side is we also use some really kind of old school approaches to this. One thing we did, Larry, was we bought, we mass purchased like a number of just erasable whiteboards and whiteboard markers, and we mailed them home to the kids, so that, when the kids are at home, they've got their whiteboard marker that they can answer a question and show the teacher right away. And that investment was, a few dollars and, the time to put them in the mail, but it's, that ability to have the interaction with the kids. And so, finding that balance between the live instruction where the teacher's talking and providing content and information, versus being live with the kids and interacting, versus being available to the kids so that they can work independently and you can let them stretch and try something and, risk making the mistake, but being there to help support them and catch them so that they don't practice something wrong 100 times and learn it the wrong way. It's striking a balance. It's not that one of those things is the right thing all day. It's finding the right balance of those different things throughout the day to engage kids.
Yeah, I point out to parents that technology doesn't always have to have a battery or cord. Right. It could be low tech, like a whiteboard. We have a question on what privacy laws pertain to online instruction, such as using Zoom classrooms. And the answer is, whether a child is in special education or regular education, there is a federal law called FERPA, which stands for Family Education Privacy Rights Act, FERPA. That law is the privacy law that requires school districts to maintain the confidentiality and privacy of educational records, information about any child, whether they have a disability and an IEP or they don't. And there have been stories of late in the newspaper and elsewhere about Zoom and whether they are maintaining those privacy features. And I know some school districts have chosen not to use Zoom. I take no position one way or the other, because they are concerned with maintaining privacy. So I have seen Google Classrooms, Google Chat. You had mentioned another platform put out by Google, and a couple of others. So you need to check with those, with your school district, and check with the provider, the platform, to see what standard of privacy they maintain and what levels of security, because whether it's online instruction, PPT meetings, informal meetings with the school, all of the information should be as private as possible, and to maintain confidentiality of sometimes very sensitive information. We have a couple of people that provided some questions, I think, through chat. Let's see, what did I do? Give me 1 second, please.
Larry, while you're looking at those, I'm just gonna, I think I never kind of finished that answer for you on the transition piece, in part because I wasn't sure if somebody was asking about, like, what do we normally do for transition versus what we do this year. But, you know, we are, you know, we've, you know, transitions to public schools, transitions to private schools, you know, we've been really working with those schools to understand where are they. I think, you know, for the public schools, it seems like, and you will have a better sense or a handle on this than I will, Larry, but it seems like each district is kind of trying to figure out how they're going to facilitate things like PPT meetings. And, you know, some districts seem to be pushing forward telephonically, or they're already doing those things telephonically. Some seem to be kind of waiting. So that's been a challenge for us. But on the flip side, you know, for the PPT meetings that, you know, that our team has been in for our students who are planning to transition to public school, you know, they've been holding those, the ones that have been held telephonically, you know, they're preparing the kids programs just like always. You know, I think for our kids who are going to transition to private schools, you know, I think all schools right now obviously are trying to figure out, you know, what is next year going to look like? What's the structure, the continuity? You know, how are they going to open? You know, are they going to open and, you know, have kids go home or vice versa? So I will say, and I took a call from an assistant superintendent of a Connecticut public school on yesterday morning. And I will tell you, you know, it's really clear that the public school officials I've spoken to are really trying to figure, you know, they're trying to figure out, you know, what to do. And they do have a lens on next year. They really are trying to figure out how to provide resources to, you know, to all their learners, but especially kids who are disenfranchised somehow, either because of lack of access or because they're in special ed or for whatever reason. They've been good conversations that I've had with those public school officials.
I don't know if this happens in your school, but I know it happens in public schools. Do you have any opinion about retaining children in a particular grade because they're not making appropriate progress, and because of the online learning? You know, should they repeat the grade? Should they go forward without the skill set? Do you have any thoughts on that? I don't think that happens in your school, but I was wondering if you might have a philosophical approach to that, an answer to that question.
Boy, this is really hard. And it's really hard because I'm not a believer in holding kids back. I think with, you know, with rare exception, it's just usually not a good idea. And it's usually not a good idea because, you know, it's typically just going to be a repeat of what they got before. And if it didn't work the first time, you know, I'm not so sure why it's gonna work differently the second time. And it seems like in the majority of cases, it's holding a kid back isn't the effective solution. It's providing the right type of instruction that's going to push the needle forward for that student. And the second thing is, you know, there are a number of studies, and I'm sure you're aware of these, but there are a number of studies, you know, that talk about, you know, the negative social emotional impact of holding a kid back. And there are a number of studies about the impact of holding kids back on things like, you know, self-perception, about the, you know, self-efficacy around, you know, abilities in different academic areas, high school graduation rates. I mean, there are a number of consequences. The flip side of that is when you're in a time like right now where their kids literally just not getting the services, not just that they need, but that they're entitled to. I mean, this is a good time to use the word entitlement. I mean, you know, everybody, you know, they're entitled to a free, appropriate public education. And if a family or his child is not getting that free, appropriate public education, you know, that needs to be remedied somehow. I still don't think the remedy for that is holding a kid back. I think that's not the remedy. I think, but it, you know, with these circumstances, I'm a little reluctant because I'm not sure what the remedy is. You know, I just don't know. But I'm always really careful about thinking about the impact of holding a kid back.
Yeah, I tend to agree with everything you've said because from my perspective, I use analogies also. It's like sitting through a bad movie a second time and expecting it to get better. And then on a more practical sense, it's probably a denial of that free, appropriate public education that you talked about. That should be examined to determine why the child is not learning, achieving goals and objectives, making meaningful educational progress. I tend to agree with you that retention is not a good decision. What appears to be our last question is directly related to what you do each and every day. During this time of remote learning, how could schools provide children with dyslexia with a multi-sensory Orton-Gillingham reading instruction? And the subpart to that question, is there a way to do Orton-Gillingham instruction or to provide Orton-Gillingham instruction remotely? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so definitely. I mean, we've been training teachers, in Orton-Gillingham remotely even before this. So we've been training teachers remotely before this, and we certainly have a number of colleagues who work with students remotely. And in fact, as part of the training that we do with teachers, part of it is the follow-up supervision of watching these teachers we've trained work with kids, and sometimes they are working with them remotely. And what we're observing is a remote lesson that's been recorded just like we are right now. So not only is it possible, but it's happening. There are definitely Orton-Gillingham tutors who are tutoring online. We run our tutorial classes online. It's different, for sure, but again, it's just about kind of rethinking it. And I'll make a quick plug for our Southport Collab. So if you go to Southport Collab, so it's the word Southport followed by COLAB.org, southportcollab.org. We have a number of free resources on there, including free webinars about how to do some of these things online. We've got, resources and webinars on there. This Thursday, and these are all free. We're offering all these things for free. We've got a free resource, free webinar we're doing this Thursday on leveraging Keynote, which is on all the Macs and iPads, and it's just, again, using simple tools to use for things, strategies for instruction in areas of Orton-Gillingham. So definitely check out the Southport Collab. And the other big resource I'm going to point everybody to, Larry, is Haskins, the Haskins Global Literacy Hub. So if you go to the Haskins Global Literacy Hub, and you can find it through the Haskins Laboratories website. If you just Google Haskins and you'll find it. But the Haskins Global Literacy Hub has been collating. We've been working, we've got an incredible team. People like Marianne Wolf, people like Maureen Lovett, people like Ken Pugh, Fumiko Hoft, who's at UConn. She does a lot of imaging work at UConn, and just a number of really great experts from around the world. Augusta Bookweitz from Rio de Janeiro. We've got a number of people who are Haskins scientists, whether they're senior scientists or affiliated scientists, who have provided and either donated or provided a number of resources that Haskins has online. And these are all credible resources from places like Dr. Sharon Vaughn. I forgot to mention Dr. Vaughn. She runs the Meadows Center at UT Austin. They have some amazing resources. People like the Florida Center of Reading Research, Don Compton and Yakov Petcher and Laura Stacy. They've got a number of terrific resources on the Florida Center of Reading Research. And again, Haskins is kind of collating all these, or you can kind of push back out into like the Meadows Center or FCRR, either on social media. But we have a ton of free resources, free content that's out. Everything we do is grounded in research, whether it's at our school, whether it's through the Collab, or whether it's at places like Haskins. And either of those places, Haskins or the Collab, be on the lookout. We're going to be pushing that game out. It's called Grapho Game. It'll be in all the major app stores, iOS, Android, and Microsoft. It's going to be free of charge to download, and it's really terrific. It's it comes directly from research. It's all grounded in research. So if you're looking for really good literacy tools, pre-K through grade 5 or 6, it's a great free tool that your kids can use, and you can get the data or share the data with your school. So
we have one last question, and apparently something you said about retention provoked this parent to ask the following question: is there any time to retain a student, such as maybe the 2nd or 3rd grade, to reinforce reading comprehension and other skills versus older students where the negative factors you described will come into play? In other words, is your opinion on retention applicable to the younger student or the older student equally alike?
So, this is really a great question, Larry. Every single one of these decisions is an individual decision. And that's, I'm not answering it this way as a way not to answer the question, but, there are so many in circumstances, environmental circumstances, what is the specific learning or attention issue? What has the school done? But, even at 2nd or 3rd grade, my issue with holding a kid back is that, again, I just don't think that's the right remedy. If a child should be able to access or print or should be able to comprehend text, they might be behind in those areas. That's again, for our kids, it's really typical that our kids are coming in strong cognitive profile. They should be ahead of where they are, but they're behind. If it's, look, if there's a kid, and I'll give a specific example, and I'm not saying this is the only example, but, there are times when I've worked with kids who have been adopted from like Eastern Europe, where they've got significant delays in language development, and they're coming into school already way behind. And it's not because they didn't get the right kind of instruction, but their gaps are so significant, and their vocabulary, I mean, and they're actually going to maybe benefit from, more time in the early grades. I do think there are probably circumstances like that where you really want to look at that option and say, yeah, maybe that is the right thing for your case or your circumstance. But if it's that the kid if a student's deficient and maybe, a couple skills like reading, maybe decoding or reading comprehension or, something around math, I just don't think it's the right remedy to hold them back. If they're not achieving success in those areas, it's likely because they haven't been given the right approach or program. And it's more than likely that if we can get them the right instruction, the right approach, the right amount of time that they need to make the gains in those areas, they're going to do that. Whereas if we have them held back for the year, now what we've all agreed to is holding them at that lowest common denominator across all areas for a whole year. And I just think that's a huge risk to take.
Again, I agree with your statements and approach. As I said before, for me, it's like sitting through the same bad movie for the 2nd time and expecting it to get better. I want to thank Dr. Powers for taking time out of his busy day, and for everybody who is still with us for taking time out of your busy days as well for joining us this evening. We're very encouraged by your response, and we're going to continue to have these webinars and be responsive to your questions to the extent we can. Next week at Tuesday evening at the same time, we'll have a conversation with Jackie Jewett, who will be discussing transitioning from high school to college. Jackie is the Director of Transition Services with Carol Frankenberger and Associates. She's been involved as an educational consultant, a school advocate for over 30 years. Prior to joining Carol Frankenberger, she was the Managing Director of Educational Outreach, Parent-Student Relations at Mitchell College and Thames Academy, which is a transition program at Mitchell College. This coming Friday at 10 o'clock, we'll have another webinar with Jane Faraday of the Stamford JCC. And our guest will be Christine Lai, who's the Executive Director of the Special Education Legal Fund. And Christine will be discussing resources that her organization has for families during this COVID-19 crisis. And we will be updating periodically additional webinars and information on our website, on our Facebook page. And I want to thank Dr. Powers again for his time and wisdom and sharing that with everybody who's participated this evening. So we thank you. And
thank you, Larry. Thanks for having me. And again, thanks to the JCC for being a partner in this.
Good night.
Thank you. Night, everybody.